We're just past the 6 o'clock mark, and good evening, everyone. We'll just start recording now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Monday night session of the History Festival, the Connecting Small Histories History Festival, a collaboration between Swansea University and the Jewish Small Communities Network. And we're extraordinarily grateful for the support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We have two speakers this evening. First speaker is Jane Warner, who has been coordinating the Connecting Small Histories research on Somerset and the West Country. Jane's a retired nurse after working for 40 years and has written for clinical journals. She co-founded the Somerset Jewish Social and Cultural Group 9 years ago, and welcome if you are a member of that group this evening, and loves creating and sharing traditional Jewish food when they get together. And we all dream of getting together, of course, don't we? Our second speaker is John Cowell. John grew up in Blackpool, Lancashire, and worked for Westminster City Libraries for many years. Since retirement, he's written and published books on the history of the Preston Jewish community, and then jointly with Hilary Thomas, who of course is also here this evening, welcome Hilary, on the history of the Bolton Jewish community. John has been chairman of the Liverpool branch of the Jewish Historical Society since the end of 2018, and his quite fabulous book on the Southport Jewish community was published at the end of 2019. And so reminding everyone that during the presentations, we ask you to be on mute. I'd like to welcome Jane and ask her to present the first in our session on fisticuffs and regrettable incidents. And Jane's paper is My Somerset Journey with Myer Jacobs.
Thank you, Trish. Before I launch into my 15-minute talk, I'd like to say thank you primarily to Trish, my go-to person who pretty much steered me in the right direction and who was able to ferret out many of the relevant sources of information I'm about to present to you this evening. My thanks also go to Ed for his sterling work for small Jewish communities. Thanks to Tony and Carter, Peter Gary, IT Mike as a bribe, and all my fellow volunteer researchers, Hilary, Anne, Rachel and Lisa. You guys are a tough act to follow. So my journey with Myer Jacobs started quite inconsequentially with a throwaway line I'd read in a thesis by Rabbi Bernard Susser, when a Jew, one Myer Jacobs, became mayor of Taunton in 1877. My journey may have begun inconsequentially, but what I was to discover with subsequent research turned this on its head and was pretty jaw-dropping and arguably has important implications even today. I think a little scene setting is needed about Taunton, the county town of Somerset. And in this slide, I have a big question to ask. If you are Jewish and just happen to live in Somerset, well, for a start, according to the 2011 census for Taunton Deane, you will be only one of 69 Jewish people. That's in marked contrast to the 444 people who self-identified as Jedi Knights. The other issue is it's 34 miles door to door from my home to the nearest synagogue in Exeter, where I'm a member. So how do we balance our Jewish and secular identities when living in Somerset? The next slide sums it up for me quite nicely. Next slide, please. Why do people come to live in Somerset? There are many experiences which come into play. The most common is for people to move from larger, well-established Jewish communities for economic reasons, such as employment or job relocation. Other stories are sadder and more personal. I myself grew up in a place you might possibly have heard of, Edgware, and then reached Somerset over many decades via St Albans United and then St Albans Masorti synagogues, then to Maidenhead, and 16 years ago I joined the wonderful Exeter Hebrew congregation. It has a proud history of existence for over 250 years and has a very warm, welcoming heart. Now, to many people who hail from London and Manchester, it's likely that Somerset might seem like the edge of a very old map before you fall over the edge. Terra incognita, here be dragons, or in this instance, here be dreidels. At least you'll be grateful I've no intention whatsoever of labouring the dreidels analogy by maybe explaining that in Somerset, you can shin up Glastonbury Tor in the afternoon and with gimlet eyes watch haymaking. I can only wonder what it must have been like for Myer Jacobs all those years ago. And in the next slide, the Somerset Jewish Social and Cultural Group will be having its 10th anniversary this autumn. And this is the kind of thing that we hear over and over again. But although this is one small Jewish community and Taunton itself never has had a synagogue, there are other thriving Jewish communities in other parts of Somerset, such as the online Lvov in Bath, which celebrated its first birthday this week, and not forgetting Bristol's thriving community. But that's enough of Somerset of the present day. After all, this is a history festival. And so in the next slide, here are some historical references to the Jewish community in Somerset. Other references, well, it's all been pretty nebulous. For example, finding a six-pointed star on some buildings, or walking past a local street called Mount Nebo. With Disraeli, he stood for Parliament in 1835, and until the Jews Relief Act of 1858, MPs were required to take the oath of allegiance on the true faith of a Christian. Minehead in the Second World War was particularly interesting, and research between Trish and myself continues. We've discovered many of the names and occupations of people living there at the time of the Second World War. Many had fled to England from abroad, and others, for example, came from Plymouth to avoid the bombings. But now we turn to Myer Jacobs, specifically the hatched part of his life. Well, he was born in, next slide please, Canterbury. In 1827, and on the basis of who rather than what, you know, I contacted my husband's uncle and aunt Cedric and Lily Rebuck, who have lived in Canterbury for many years and whose knowledge of the history of the Jewish community there is vast. But they've seen the community dwindle and the synagogue close down. So as you can see from the slide, there were two Jacobs families living in Canterbury at that time. And as luck wouldn't have it, I managed to pick the wrong Jacobs family at first. Myer Jacobs was born in 1827, son of Jacob, born circa 1800, who was a broker, and Ella, and they had 6 sons in total: Myer, Henry or Harry, William, Augustus or Asher, Samuel, and Leon. But the question was, why would somebody start life in Canterbury and find themselves living in Taunton? One preliminary theory was the link between Chatham, East Kent, and Plymouth, Devon. This link was principally about supplying Navy dockyards with West Indies rum. However, Plymouth is 78 miles from Taunton, not your easy commute, which is when Trish discovered that Myer had travelled with his brother Harry to Gloucester and also to 33 Dudley Street, Wolverhampton, where he worked as a general dealer. So Myer's hatched, and on 9th of January 1856, he's about to become matched. Next slide, please. And this is his wife, Matilda Jacobs, probably taken around 1877. Matilda was born in Liverpool on the 1st of May, 1824, to John and Frances Nathan. She was 2 or 3 years older than Myer. She had many siblings, 9, I think. John Nathan was a prosperous jewellery merchant and watch manufacturer. The Nathan family must have had some sort of connection to Ireland because, as you'll see in the next slide, they got married in Dublin. And I'm indebted to Peter Gary here for his research on their wedding in Dublin. Next slide, please. So this is Myer's journey to Taunton. He left in 1851 and they were in the census. He and his brother Harry were together. In 1861, they were in Gloucester with Harry. 1871, Myer arrives in Taunton. He and Matilda are found at 23 Fore Street. He was very entrepreneurial and had a shop, the Little Dustpan. Now, Myer pushed and pushed and pushed for the opportunity for Taunton to become more self-governing and go ahead. He was instrumental in getting reincorporation happening in the town of Taunton, which meant that he could have, there could be a mayor. He also tried to reform Taunton market practices from a Board of Health perspective and get markets assigned to public authorities, but failed. Now, Myer wasn't one for being laid back in terms of meetings. One became particularly disorderly when it was reported that in a political meeting in 1868 to choose a parliamentary candidate, one speaker read out extracts of a pamphlet attacking Benjamin Disraeli. Well, Myer saw red and he responded, "Mr. Disraeli is not a traitor, he is not dishonest, he is not a renegade, he is not a disgrace to religion and morality." And we can also see, as in the next slide, this lovely census, which Trish found for me. Now, Matilda and Myer had no children. And before coming to Taunton, the 1861 census has them living at 35 Westgate Street, St Nicholas, Gloucester. Now, Myer's job descriptions over time have included alderman, furniture maker, general dealer, commission agent, and retired shopkeeper. And I like this particular census information, which Trish discovered, as I think it says a lot about the man in terms of how he felt affection and respect for his employees at the time, viewing them as part of one big family. I don't know if you can see that, but he was a general dealer, etc., with his apprentices. And Myer Jacobs' political influence grows. And then here he is in the next slide, in the centre there. And he is now Mayor of Taunton. You'd think it would be plain sailing, you'd be wrong. So the next slide, the great controversy. So in the Jewish Chronicle, we had the gratification to announce that Mr. Myer Jacobs, a co-religionist, had been elected the first mayor of Somerset. However, the local vicar expresses disapproval. And now, if you'll permit me, I'm just going to read you these letters because I think they are very, very worth sharing. So this is the first letter which the Reverend Frederick Jeremiah Smith sends to Myer Jacobs. Sir, it appears to be very generally supposed that you, who have become our mayor, are an unbaptized person, and consequently not a Christian. If, as I hope is the case, there be no truth in this supposition, you will authorize me publicly to say so, and thus relieve very many persons in our town from an exceedingly painful and distressing impression. It would also be an act of injustice to the aldermen and town councillors who have elected you to free them from the imputation under which they now rest of having knowingly chosen for the chief officer and in some sense representative of our town one who does not believe in him who they themselves profess not only to believe in, but to worship as the Lord and God. I propose to publish this letter, together with any answer which you may send to it. I am your obedient servant, Frederick Smith, Vicar of St. John's, Taunton. So Myer Jacobs replies, Reverend Sir, I have received a letter bearing your signature, and but for recognizing your writing, would have deemed it forgery. I am proud to avow myself a member of the Hebrew faith and of a people who, in free England, have attained some of the highest official positions in the land. I am equally proud to know that my Christian neighbours and friends have not permitted religious difference to influence them in their choice of their first mayor. I shall ever retain a pleasing recollection of the high distinction that has been conferred upon me, and shall not permit anything to mar the pleasure I feel in subscribing myself Myer Jacobs, Mayor of Taunton. Then the Daily Telegraph weighs in. The Daily Telegraph makes the following comment upon the correspondence. It is surprising what an amount of ignorance there is among many of those who are generally regarded as belonging to the educated classes. For example, the Reverend Frederick Jeremiah Smith, Master of Arts and Vicar of Taunton, does not seem to be aware that the great battle for the emancipation of the Jews has been long ago fought and won in this country. It would appear that the town of Taunton has thought proper to elect a Jewish gentleman named Jacobs as its mayor, and the worthy vicar is greatly distressed at this proceeding. It has occurred to him that his mayor is not a baptized person, and a fearful vision of the intolerableness of life under the municipal jurisdiction of a chief magistrate, and it goes on and on and on, and basically everybody weighs in, and even though there's feedback from abroad, so it was quite nasty, really. So next slide, please. This is Matilda's last resting place. She died 22nd of May, 1895, age 71. And then next slide. So Myer's last years. He retired in 1881. He was very fond of flowers and he loved amateur dramatics. He kept his Mansfield House gardens open to the public on Sunday afternoons. Today, the garden is somewhat overgrown and houses a suite of offices. He was also involved with the Taunton Flower Show, which we call the Chelsea of the West, and he was known to be a very generous man. He actually gave prizes in shooting competitions. And now for the sad bit, final slide, please. Thank you. So here we are. He's passed away. Now, many tributes were paid to Myer Jacobs at the funeral, because it's not an exaggeration to say that his hard work, perseverance and drive made Taunton what it is today. And sadly, he's pretty much forgotten. According to the Taunton Courier, Bristol and Exeter Journal and Western Advertiser, the Reverend Worthington, who conducted the funeral, had compiled a special form of service for the occasion in keeping with the tenets of the Hebrew religion. His many nephews attended, as well as the town dignitaries, the public, and some Freemasons. In his will, he bequeathed a total of £9,199, 5 shillings and 5 pence, to his nephews Daniel J. and William Percy Mitchell. So that's my journey with Myer Jacobs. I think of it as a loving hesped, albeit 120 years late. Thank you all for watching and listening.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's a fascinating journey, and it's one that I think you're going to carry on pursuing as well. We'll leave the questions to after the second paper. So if I could ask again, everyone to mute, and Jane yourself to mute as well. And if I could ask John to unmute, and we're going to continue our journey of controversy with some unfortunate incidents in the life of the Southport Jews.
Okay, I seem to have managed to get so far with sharing my screen. and hope that at this point, when I set up that it should be beginning any second. I know the suspense is killing. That's it. Okay, there are things you would have hoped to avoid. But remember Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will. There are corollaries to it as well, such as any attempt to put it right will merely make it worse. And if one thing goes wrong, everything else will, and all at the same time. When the rabbis, ministers, readers and others were asked in Southport, they might have said, if it is possible to deal appropriately with deaths and illnesses among members in an orderly fashion, a day at a time, you will have to deal with them all at once on the same day, and one of the staff will be ill. I'm using this different way of looking at the entire history of the community because it raises several other questions and allows us to admit that not everything was always well or successfully handled. But first, here is the book from which I draw my stories. Small commercial, and there is a picture of it which my friend Michelle Sanderson took for me very kindly, so it's displaying her kitchen, which is a great deal more orderly than my kitchen. So thank you, Michelle, and we will go on to the first honorary secretary. The very first honorary secretary of the Southport Hebrew congregation back in 1893, even before the foundation of the Jewish Historical Society. Now, I'm not going to keep on doing that. It's rather amusing, but I think it could be irritating if I did it again, so don't worry, it won't happen again. Lionel Moss, the first honorary secretary, was previously known as Moses Lazarus. At the time of the 1881 census, he was a 19-year-old at home in the West London Synagogue at 34 Berkeley Street, Marylebone, London. And that was a Reformed synagogue. And there's a picture of it on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side you can see the census entry for 1881. His father, who was Isaiah Lazarus, I think is transcribed by the census enumerator as Josiah, which is probably a more familiar name. And there is Moses, two down from him, a traveller at this point. So he was a peddler, in effect. Now, his father, by the way, was the Shamus. I didn't draw your attention to that. Lionel Moss was quite an active kind of character. There was a bit of a problem between him and his wife, Estelle Miriam, because he seems to have had rather an unsuccessful business career. He became bankrupt earlier in 1893, the year of the foundation of the congregation, having been a fent dealer, which means that he dealt in odds and ends of cloth, possibly for jobs like upholstery. And here is how the Southport Visitor came to report on the case in which he was involved. Under the title Strange Assault Case at Southport, he was summoned for assault on his mother-in-law, Sarah Saki, at 144 Duke Street in the previous week, and on his sisters-in-law for good measure. He was trying to take his daughter back from her mother, because the two of them were separated at this point. A policeman was called but said he could not interfere when he saw Moss strike his mother-in-law, Mrs. Saki. But he did tell her to put some raw beef on her eye. An auctioneer's porter, whom Moss had involved, testified that he had seen Moss hit Mrs. Saki in the eye with his fist. So there's no doubt she got a black eye. The bench deemed the assault proved against Moss, who was bound over in the cases of Josephine and Edith Saki, the sisters-in-law, in the sum of £20 to keep the peace for 6 months, and to pay the costs. For assaulting his mother-in-law, Sarah Saki, they fined him 20 shillings. The black eye must still have been visible, so he wasn't the ideal honorary secretary from a publicity point of view. The newspaper makes no reference to the religion of those involved, and indeed the name Saki could have been understood as a French name, which it probably was. Unless the word strange is code for a foreigner in this case. And the picture up there top right isn't Lionel Moss, of course. It's the famous Jewish boxer Daniel Mendoza from the last third of the 18th century and the first third of the 19th century. Let us move on. An impossible appointment. They really got it wrong this time. By 1902, the congregation needed more than one paid officer, and they duly advertised for an assistant teacher, assistant reader, and choirmaster. And at a general meeting of the congregation in early February 1902, they appointed Philip Flower of London. This method of appointment sounds a little bit chaotic perhaps, but it gives the congregation the opportunity to see how he would behave in front of a large group of people. But, oh dear, Mr. Flower, the odd thing about him was that he was almost certainly a Gentile. He'd been baptized twice in St. Pancras Church in London. He was a pianist in the 1891 census, but by the time of the 1901 census, his profession was described rather touchingly as precarious. An unhappy position for a man of 43 with a wife and 2 children, the younger one a boy, age 3, also called Philip. Not the normal naming pattern in Jewish families. So the case for his being a Gentile seems strong. So why on earth did the congregation appoint him? Well, perhaps, he probably did, perhaps his personality was convincing. Maybe he played very well. I assume he was playing the piano. And perhaps he looked Jewish, or had mixed with Jewish people living in London with its large Jewish population. If he didn't understand Hebrew, he would certainly not last very long. But perhaps he thought that the congregation all spoke and understood English, and he was probably desperate. Another point, maybe it didn't occur to anybody that a Gentile would apply for the post, which had been advertised, after all, in the Jewish Chronicle, not in the St. Pancras Guardian. A congregation advertising in the Jewish Chronicle would hardly have felt the need to stipulate applicants must be Jewish. So he was soon gone. And of course, that's not his photograph, it's Liberace, who many of us remember as one of the best pianists we've ever heard. And on. Now I want to redress the balance a little bit with a few comments on the Harris House for Girls, which some of you I think will have heard. This was one of the finest hours of the Southport Jewish congregation and took place in World War II. It was the setting up of a home for girls who'd been saved from the Holocaust by the Kinder Transport. Subscribers to the home were recruited, and largely by Mrs. Ruth Livingstone, about whom you can read on the JSCN website at the address which I will give you. There it is. And that tells you quite a bit about it with some photographs. A very interesting item. It opened early in 1939 after a huge amount of preparation, thought and planning. But even this was spoiled. Even this was spoiled when the wartime government changed the status of Southport, making it a protected area in June 1940. The poor girls had to leave, though they were given financial support by the people who run the home, and many of them moved to London. There have been TV programmes about their reunion many years later. Now, I'm going to make you shiver. This represents a blizzard, rather obviously. On an incredibly cold day in late January 1942, there was unwelcome publicity for the Southport community as a large group of people were caught up in a police raid on a gambling club at the Carlton Club at 121 to 123 Lord Street, which was until recently the Argos store, but rebuilt, of course. The headline read, "Police raid disturbs club card players," and the subheadline was, "Swoop follows letter of warning." Now remember the letter of warning. The first line of the long report said, "Poker tables, packs of playing cards and scorecards were exhibited at Southport Police Court on Wednesday, when in a 5 hours hearing of a case based on a club raid, fines totaling £150 were imposed, with costs of £38.16. To a modern reader, this kind of event must seem old-fashioned. People doing something harmless in private for their own entertainment, but these were very different times when such things were criminal. So what happened? Joseph Plessner, 40, and his wife Irene, also 40, were fined for keeping a common gaming house and allowing the use of the premises for unlawful gaming. David Platt, 43, was fined for similar offences and for managing a common gaming house. His wife, Millicent Leslie Platt, was fined for essentially the same misdemeanour. But Mrs. Platt said that the club had made £236 for war charities. She also mentioned that each Monday afternoon there was a knitting bee to provide comforts for the troops through the Southport War Comforts Fund. So worthy activities. The full list of people present, which I reproduce in the book, seems to have been largely or entirely Jewish in religion or ethnicity. It included a famous chess-playing barrister from Liverpool called Gerald Abrahams, who represented himself, with Leslie Black, local solicitor, representing most of the other defendants. The background to this case is the police have been watching the house for some time from an adjoining building on various dates and from 3 p.m. until blackout. There were 2 days of watching back in November 1941 and 2 in January 1942. As far back as August 1941, the Chief Constable had written to warn Mr. Platt and Mr. Plessner not to commit any offence that would bring them within the law. A warrant was obtained and executed on the 18th of January 1942 under the Gaming Act of 1845, almost 100 years old. 2 police inspectors, 3 sergeants and a number of constables simultaneously visited the premises at 10:30 p.m. Gerald Abrahams submitted that the club was not a gaming club, a gaming house, and that draw poker had not been proved other than as a game of skill. Charges were dismissed against several of those present who said that they had merely been taking refreshments in the club and had not played. Excuse me. David Platt said that he had not the slightest idea that they were breaking the law. He'd forgotten about the warning, hadn't he? Mrs. Platt said that it had not been a paying venture. Now, here is a very different case. When, in 1965, the new, or reform as it later became, Synagogue was in difficulties with its recently departed rabbi and the expense that he had caused them. In the summer of 1965, Rabbi Dr. Albert B. Belton, previously known as Bela Berendt, was appointed rabbi at the Reformed Synagogue, which was formed after the war, after the Second World War, I should say. He had been chief rabbi in the Budapest ghetto during the 1940s, working with the government of Admiral Horthy in World War II to save Jewish lives, and had then survived a concentration camp. As early as September or October 1965, Rabbi Belton gave 6 months' notice of resignation and said he reserved the right to leave before the expiry of his notice. The 17th annual report and accounts of the Southport New Synagogue in January 1966 records that Rabbi Dr. Belton arrived but resigned and left us in December. And it adds, with the stipend and expenses of our minister, we have gone to the limit. Our income at present is not sufficient to meet our expenditure. And to quote from a short biography I have in the book of this interesting figure, Rabbi Dr. Belton, also known as Bela Berendt, born to Budapest 1911, was tried by a people's court after the war for collaboration with the Nazis and imprisoned. He was then released early after appeals from Jewish bodies, migrated to the USA and then to Germany and on to England. But he left Southport Reformed Synagogue after 4 months complaining of inferior living and working conditions and rude treatment he returned to the USA and in 1979 sued the Hungarian Jewish Studies series of publications by the Holocaust researcher Randolph L. Graham, in which members of the Hungarian Jewish Council at the time, that is in wartime, recalled his willingness to collaborate. He died in 1984 in New York City, still involved in litigation to clear his name. There's clearly more to this story than emerges from this. And this is the splendid synagogue in Dohany Street in Budapest, which he may well have been familiar with, and a picture of the man himself with his yellow star. And I think one can see he might have been a rather prickly character. So, a bit of local government now. The first Jewish mayor of Southport, it looks like a sensational headline, doesn't it? Guilty of corruption. The political career of ex-alderman Sidney Hepworth, who was the first Jewish mayor of Southport, ended at Leeds in 1975, February. He had been the first Jewish mayor of Southport in 1962 and was at the time leader of the Liberals on the council. But in 1975 he was found guilty of corruption and sentenced to 3 years in jail in one of a series of trials of those who'd been corrupted by the architect John Poulsen, who offered financial inducements to various local government leaders in different towns and cities to get them to support his redevelopment schemes. And here is a picture of him. I hope you can see that. I'm sorry if I've gone and put it in too far up in the top right-hand corner of the slide. In his mayoral robes, which is in the town hall to this day. It was kindly taken by Councillor Brodie Brown, who was a modern Liberal Democrat. Now, this is a collection of notes I put together in the book on the Hebrew congregation and a whole lot of senior wardens who resigned prematurely, some of whom died in office. I declare an interest in management theory and practice, having attended a couple of courses on that. And I've also had plenty of opportunities in my career to observe good, bad, and indifferent managers. Not only were some resignations before the natural end of their terms sudden, they were also sometimes unexplained in the minutes of the Southport Hebrew congregation. These sudden premature resignations happened in 1920, 1921, 1936, 1942, 1963 and 1967. Two others resigned early, and they were Solomon Myer Harris, who was a dominant figure in the congregation for its first 30 years. He resigned in 1917 because of difficulties with a man called Samuel Claff. Samuel Claff himself resigned in 1936 because he couldn't get any of his projects carried out. As this list of all those dates is a considerable proportion of the people who became head of the congregation or senior warden, it seems worthwhile to me to consider the reasons for some of the resignations. Here are two that I know about. Harold Brodie in 1945 had clearly exceeded his powers and resigned after pressure from colleagues. This emerges from the minutes of the council. Reg Winthorpe resigned in 1967 because the general body of the congregation, at a meeting of all the members, would not support the salary proposal he and his executive put forward for Rabbi Aloni. As this short paragraph suggests, there were various reasons for premature resignations. It seems likely to me that they may also have arisen in one or two cases, at least partly because the congregation was growing during much of the period in operation, and this posed serious questions about financing and other managerial matters. So the job got bigger, and senior wardens couldn't always please everyone, and perhaps some of them are exhausted by it all. 4 senior wardens actually died in office, and I have a picture of Herman Plotzker, who died in 1908 and had a very grand funeral. He was a man who left England for a warmer climate because of health problems, but returned to the benign climate of Southport. One must admire his patent leather hair, I think, and his extensive moustache. The funeral was on a grand scale, with a number of coaches occupied by his brothers and then dignitaries of the Southport Hebrew congregation. And we move on to, just to redress the balance a bit, I want to talk about just some of the good that Southport community has done. They were generous donors from a very early period. They raised money for worthy causes. For example, when the HMS Victoria collided with another vessel near Tripoli and sank in 1893, losing over 300 men, that was in the first year of the congregation. Then they contributed generously to a fund for the victims of the Kishinev pogrom. That's almost in South Russia. It's in what is now Moldova. That was in 1903. And they had regular collections for the local infirmary on Hospital Sunday, which became an annual event. Later, the congregation provided financial support towards the building of the War Monument on Lord Street, and over many years supported the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in the late 1940s, members of the community set up and supported the old age home, providing holidays for poorer Jews in the cities at first, and later permanent homes for many retired Jews and others. Nowadays, not all the people who live in it are Jewish. And finally, for the benefit of anyone interested in acquiring a copy of the book, here is the information you need. And I would suggest the easiest thing is to note the details of the website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John, for that fantastic presentation. You anticipated us. Unfortunately we do have a bit of a problem with the sound on your link to us, but we hope that we can actually make sure that people can get access to the presentation if they struggled to hear some parts of it tonight. We have some time for questions, and I noticed some items have been put into the chat. I wonder if I could, first of all, take us to Somerset because we have a rather interesting contribution. I'm hoping he's still with us, from Walter Rothschild, whose father was sent to Minehead. Walter, are you still here?
Yes, present and correct.
Yeah. Would you like to share a little bit of your Minehead story with us?
There's hardly any of it, unfortunately. I've been researching my father's history and my grandfather's biography. And during the war, my grandparents, he'd been to Dachau, then they got out to Switzerland, lived in Geneva for a while on nothing, and they'd sent my father, aged 16, to England. And he was sent first, not to Kindertransport, but through family contacts. They put him through this contact into Seaford School near New Haven. And then because that became a closed area for aliens, he was sent somewhere to London. And as long as post could still get through, they were trying desperately to look after him from a distance. So we have a few letters. And when I heard that, when I logged on today, I suddenly thought to myself, hang on, wasn't Dad somewhere? And I went, while I was trying to do multitasking, listening with one ear and going on my computer to find my text on that one. So I've just mentioned for Jane, if you don't know that name, maybe you probably do, the Colmars of Minehead. My grandparents had lived in Baden-Baden, so clearly he must have been some family friend who stepped in to look after their son as a refugee. I've no idea how long they stayed in Minehead, or I saw on your slide there'd been a congregation there during the war. Yeah. So that was that's almost the sum total of my contribution. I've only been to Minehead once, and I can remember still you have some concrete bunkers next to the railway line near Blue Anchor. So that was also an area being prepared for invasion and so forth.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll mute myself again, but that was that.
No, thank you very much. That's brilliant. Trish and I have researched various names of people in Minehead, because the shul was I actually went there to take some photos and lurk around bushes and stuff. It's now a sort of house really, rather than an obvious synagogue. And I do have some names. Jacob Zeitlin, who was a medical practitioner or ophthalmic surgeon, his wife Ida Zeitlin, Henry Gelber, who sold boot and leather goods, was a manufacturer. The wives seemed to be unpaid domestic duties was their job, plus ça change. And there was a Samuel Goldschneider, who was a diamond merchant, and his wife, Owen Palm, an archaeologist and author, and his wife Hildegard. There was a little boy, a 13-year-old called David Rubin, who was there. Agnes Warburg, she was a lady's companion. So there's quite a few there round about Minehead, and it was an Ashkenazi Orthodox synagogue. So I'm afraid I didn't have your family member listed, but it doesn't mean that I can't research it more.
We better go and look again. Vanessa Wolfman has asked in the chat, in fact, to follow up on that, Jane. Where was this house in Minehead? Where she suggests that, given that she lives near there and would like to visit it.
It's I've got it written down somewhere and I can't remember, but it's south. I mean, if you name some bits, it's sort of 5 minutes walk from the coast. It's very, very upmarket. It's a very nice area, very residential. Southport, Warden Road, something like that. Yeah, does that make sense?
Hi, Jane. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Warden Road. Is it in Warden Road?
Yes, it is.
I think they're sort of 1920s houses.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Can you remember the number of the house or the name?
I've got it written down somewhere and I haven't got it with me at the moment, but what I will do, I've got it in my voluminous notes, and if I email it to Trish or Tony.
Or Tony, yeah.
If I email it to you, Tony, then you can send it on. Is that all right? So I'll definitely. Thank you.
One more thing, Jane.
Yeah.
I've been trying
Yeah.
to.
Bearing in mind also that today I think it is a private house, so
It is, yeah.
I'm not sure it's as you were somewhat cautious about even photographing the outside of it, Jane. It's
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, it is a landmark. Yeah.
I wonder how it became used. Obviously, it was a very short-term congregation, and
Yes.
obviously people without any real resources. You mentioned the women being in domestic service. That's quite probably how they got a visa. I mean, they may well have been working for a family. It's quite possible the woman came over as a domestic servant. Her husband was allowed to stay on and drive the car or do the gardening or something like that, whatever his official profession may have been. And it's possible that one or two families actually had a house and said, let's meet in our front room for a service, something like that.
That wouldn't
I don't know it,
surprise
I'm
me.
just guessing. But...
Yeah, no, that wouldn't surprise me at all. So I think that would be perfectly feasible, because that's how a lot of communities did start to get together, isn't it? When people started a community, they'd meet in people's houses, and then gradually things developed into a synagogue. But it definitely was consecrated as an Ashkenazi synagogue during the time of the Second World War. Thanks.
Whilst we're on the subject of the Second World War, John, I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up on the Harris House, because it's very familiar. We had a session last week in the festival where a girls' hostel had to be moved for precisely the same reason, that an area became either a special designated area or protected area. But in this particular instance, they moved them to London, which doesn't sound to me like the safest place they could have moved them to.
Yeah, can you hear me any better?
Yes.
It's a little bit better. There's a little high-pitched whine now, I'm afraid.
I don't know where that's coming from. Yes, they didn't move them to London. What they did was they gave them the fare to get them to London or wherever they wanted to go. Because there wasn't really much they could do about it once the poor girls had to leave.
So it was unlike other stories that we've heard where the children, the girls, were actually moved by the community to another place. They were actually just they must have been slightly older, perhaps, to be given the choices of where they went.
Most of them, I think, were late teenagers by that time. Yeah. Yes, about 20 of them.
Are there any other questions? I'm just scrolling through the chat here as well, and we had a couple of people who have unfortunately had to leave slightly early, although they very happy to have Southport on the map this evening. Going back to that name.
John mute.
Sorry.
The noises.
Yeah. Going back to the name Saki, which was Julian has actually commented that there was Saki who composed liturgical music, and I guess the question might be whether you think they might be related.
Yes, I think they probably were related to that Saki who was in Liverpool, because Lionel Moss's wife, Estelle Miriam, was actually born in Liverpool. So my guess is they must have been related.
Yeah.
But I should say that they very soon left Southport and went to live in London, where he became a monumental mason. And I think he failed at that.
Yeah, we have. I mean, it's actually some of the stories we've been uncovering have been of sort of repeated attempts to do things and slight failures at them. I don't know whether I could bring Jane in here and ask you very briefly to perhaps take Myer's family story that little bit further for us, and talk a little bit about his nephew.
His nephew was a very naughty boy. I will leave it at that, really, because he's not there to hear anymore to defend himself. Yeah, he did get into big trouble in terms of a legal naughty. Trish, do you want to?
What, you mean playing chess at the wrong time of night or something like that?
No, he seems to have benefited from the deaths of both of his uncles in terms of, you know, being the person that managed the money, but he also seems to have got himself involved in a lot of quite high profile legal cases, and you know, seems and also seems to have been, you know, he's attracted attention from historians, I think it's the Kilburn historians, because that's where he was. So maybe we need to do a little postscript to that story. Myer, of course, would not have lived to see this, thank goodness. So that's you know, sort of helpful. Ed has asked recollections of Southport to please be put into the chat, and I'm really delighted that people are responding so positively to that, and we will save the chat roll as part of the meeting record this evening. Obviously, Jane, you have Myer experiencing quite horrendous anti-Semitism,
Yeah,
on here, both before he becomes the mayor and also afterwards.
yeah.
But John, I wonder whether you had any instances that you had in the records of the Southport community of that kind of very direct attack, or perhaps even more subtle attacks.
Yeah, I've got a nice one from 1907, I think it was, when a sweatshop was being run in Southport by a Gentile who employed Jewish workers. And this one ended up in court as well. And the Mr. Goldstein, who was employed by Mr. Jackson, the Gentile, reported in court that he'd had a conversation with Mr. Jackson, who had said to him, "I am a Gentile and you are a Jew and I can do what I like," which included not paying him for working long hours on a Saturday. So that's about as anti-Semitic as you can get, isn't it? There was also an episode after the Second World War when anti-Semites were sticking notices in the trees along Lord Street, anti-Semitic notices. But on the Jewish side, there was somebody who'd obviously heard about Cable Street, the Battle of Cable Street, because this chap drove around. When he came across any of these anti-Semites, he would duff them up and then quickly get back in his car and drive off before they had time to do anything about it. Nice story, that, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I had a question which I had posted, but I'll ask it while we're sort of online still, about
Please
this Rabbi
do.
Walton. I'm really intrigued that somebody from Hungary would come from America to Southport. I just wonder how they found him, whether there was a job advert, whether he had a relative. It just intrigues me. It's there were several German refugees, Austrian refugees, Czech refugees looking for jobs in England who had got out. So why somebody would come back from America to Southport is just strange. The fact that obviously it wasn't a proper fit, it wasn't a match, is quite clear from what you described. Thanks.
I think he wouldn't have fitted in anywhere. If you read about his subsequent problems and suing people for what they'd written about what he'd done in Budapest. But I think what he did was, after been liberated from his sentence in Budapest by the communist government after the war, he decided to get out of it, and he started off, as far as I remember, in, was it America and then Germany. So he really was casting about, wasn't he, for somewhere to settle down. And perhaps he thought, well, Southport sounds nice and easy, but how they got him, I really don't know. I don't think that information has survived.
It could be that somebody like David Jacobs, who I can't see online today, but Ed knows him, and people who's done research into refugee rabbis, into the history of the Reform movement. If this was a new group getting going in Southport, a new synagogue being formed, and they were looking around, where can we find somebody? Then somebody from London, like Rabbi Van der Zil, might well have had contacts, you see. And just that, having been a rabbi thrown out of jobs myself several times, I know what it's like. I also know, Julian Levy is laughing away there, he remembers Leeds. But the situation is that sometimes you get a job because you seem to fit, yeah, and sometimes you get a job because there's just nobody else around. And I can't really think that in 1940, whatever it was, 46, 47, I think you said, that there was just nobody else around, or that there was a particular group of Hungarian refugees there, or some other reason why somebody may have been attracted or invited or appointed, whatever. And Julian, I like your dirty laugh, but I disagree with you. There we go.
No, it was actually 1965 when he came to Southport, and that Reform congregation was formed in 1947. So he was about their fourth or fifth rabbi, and I think he was probably the most difficult they ever had, by a long way, by quite a long way. And I don't think there were any other people from Hungary in the Southport community. So I'll consult David Jacobs, because I know him and it would be interesting to know. Thank you for that suggestion.
Because later, of course, Rabbi Sidney Kay went there, and he was somebody who took rabbinate as a second career, following his successful career as a builder. And let me think, I was ordained 1984. He'd been there already, I think, for some years. So different people come into different places, especially in provincial congregations. It's often fascinating to see how the personalities mesh. Somebody from London feeling out of place in a smaller provincial community, and the other way as well.
And actually, on that note as well, I'm thinking about, Jane, you started your presentation with the sort of the very small numbers in Somerset. Do you think that Myer would have felt part of a community, a Jewish community in Taunton, or is there anything to suggest that actually he really was one of a very, very few?
I think he was one of a very, very few, to be quite honest. But I think he was adaptable, and like my slide with the Palwin and the Scrumpy, it had a foot in both camps. Obviously, he wouldn't have gone to, as far as I know, he wasn't a member of any synagogue, because it would have been too far. And even if he parked his carriage round the corner, I think he still would have had a problem. So I just think he was just an amazing human being. And the fact that he stuck to his guns, I'm Jewish, I follow the Hebrew faith, and didn't waver from that at all. Whatever was thrown at him was just wonderful. And I hope at some stage to try and let the council know a little bit more about him, because he seems to have been lost in, even though he did so much for Taunton. And maybe even a little commemorative plaque on Mansfield's house, who knows.
It lends itself to a fantastic sort of Myer trail, or yes, or Walter has suggested that the council should certainly name a street after him, if nothing else. I think I'd probably put a quick bid in for Matilda as well. You know, sort
Yes.
of, the great men always get remembered, the great women often don't.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Taunton has a lot of his footprints, and of course he is buried there whilst Matilda had a Jewish burial in
Yes,
Bull's
yeah,
Pond. So,
yeah.
yeah. I'm conscious of the fact that this session is due to finish at 7:15 tonight, and since Jane has actually name-checked Peter Gary already in her presentation, I think we would be remiss not to remind you of what's happening tomorrow. We are continuing our tours around the United Kingdom, and in fact we're going across the border. So I'd like first of all to thank both of our speakers this evening for their fabulous presentations, and we will obviously be making sure that they are available in some form after the History Festival. And just to remind you that tomorrow morning at 10:30 we have a date with Nathan Abrams taking us to Wales, and walking in a Jew in the Valley, and also with Professor David Cohen, who's going to be thinking about the South Wales community. And then a double whammy, because in the evening we're off to Scotland and Ireland as well, and in fact Peter will be joining us, so I hope that you will join us too. And I just, before we go, has anybody got any more points or questions they'd like to put to Jane and or John, or anything else you'd like to put in the chat? Jane.
Yes, very quickly, it's Southport, Warden Road, Minehead, TA24 5DS.
And the present residents of that property are going to be extraordinarily surprised at the interest that people are going to be showing as they walk past the front of it. Thank you so much. Thanks both again. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening and for your questions and comments. We look forward to welcoming you, not literally to Wales tomorrow, although that would be lovely, but to virtual Wales tomorrow morning at 10:30. And just to remind you that the same link works for both meetings. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Tricia.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.